December 1933, western Kansas, where the land is so flat, the wind can build speed for miles without meeting a single tree. That morning it came in low and hard, skimming the stubble fields, lifting snow into pale spirals that looked harmless until they touched skin. On a foreclosed quarter section, a man knelt beside an old boarded well and began lowering a child into it, slow, careful, like he was feeding the earth a secret. A wagon road ran a half-mile off. If anyone glanced this way, they'd see only a dry well on dead property. And that was the point, because the bank had taken the Brennan's house, but it hadn't taken what was beneath it. Not yet. Thomas Brennan kept his voice down even when no one was near. In winter, sound travels. His wife Sarah held the plank cover ready, her gloves stiff with cold. Their youngest, Emma, clutched a tin lantern with a shielded wick. The light slid down the stone throat of the well until it became a small, warm coin in a sea of dark. Thomas paused, listening. No sleigh bells, no hoofbeats, no engine. Then he nodded once and set the cover back so it sat flush-dusted with snow, like it had not been touched in years. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you remember felt like. Some stories aren't about winning, they're about not being erased. 4 months earlier, late August, Thomas came back from town, with his jaw tight and his eyes wrong, like a man carrying a load he couldn't set down. The bank was calling notes across 3 counties, 2 lean harvests, 1 hailstorm, and a drought that never truly ended had turned good farmers into bad risks on paper. The man behind the desk, a lender named Harlan Voss, spoke politely and watched Thomas like a trap watches a foot. Pay by mid-December or lose the homestead. That night, Sarah heard Thomas pacing the kitchen floor until the boards complained. Near dawn, he stopped and said a sentence that sounded like madness. "We go down." Sarah thought he meant leaving Missouri, Colorado, anywhere the rumor of work still lived. But Thomas stepped out behind the barn and pointed to the old well they'd capped years ago, when the water went bitter and then vanished. He'd sunk his teeth into that problem back then, climbing down with a rope tapping limestone, listening. The shaft was lined with fitted stone, steady as a chimney, and at the bottom past 30 feet there was a natural pocket in the rock, a cavity he'd found the day the well died. "We can't raise children in a hole," Sarah said, thinking of James and Michael and Emma's small lungs. Thomas answered without anger, "We can't raise them with nothing at all." He didn't sell it as heroics. He sold it as physics. Underground, the wind can't strip heat off your walls. Down there, the earth sits near the same temperature day and night, indifferent to blizzards. A pocket of still air, dead air, behaves like a blanket that cannot blow away. 14 weeks, Thomas said, counting on his fingers like a miner measuring timbers. 14 weeks to build a room that the bank wouldn't think to look for. And winter would be the court. If his plan was foolish, the verdict would be written in frost and breath. They worked like thieves because in a way they were stealing their own lives back from paper. Thomas and the boys hauled salvaged planks, after dark lowering them into the shaft with a block and tackle. One always stayed topside flat on his belly, watching the road between fence posts. Inside the well, Thomas moved with the calm of old habits. Before homesteading, he'd spent years underground in a lead and zinc mine near Joplin, learning how rock fails, how air moves, how a small mistake becomes a funeral. He didn't talk about bravery. He talked about load paths, moisture, and keeping hands warm enough to keep grip. The cavity at the base was barely a crouch space, at first 10 feet, across 6 feet high, the kind of hollow that feels accidental. Thomas followed the seam where limestone softened, chiseling and prying in measured bites, never taking more than the shoring could forgive. He cut a chamber 15 feet long, 12 wide, then framed it with beams and joists scavenged from the old smokehouse. Fieldstone stacked tight formed the inner skin. Clay from the creek bed became mortar mixed with dry grass so it wouldn't crack as it cured. Everything was made to do two jobs: hold weight and hold heat. The ceiling was where his mind showed itself. He laid overlapping planks like shingles, then stretched canvas over them. Feed sack cloth sealed with rendered lard so it shed moisture instead of drinking it. Above that he packed a layer of stone and then earth. That mass did three things at once. It muffled sound, resisted fire, and kept the temperature steady. In winter engineering, you don't chase warmth. You prevent loss, block the wind, trap still air, reduce the amount of space you insist on heating. Keep your fuel dry. Those rules are older than any bank. A stove was non-negotiable, but it couldn't betray them. Thomas traded his pocket watch, his last clean luxury, for a small cast-iron box stove meant for chuck wagons. Tiny, mean, efficient. The problem was the pipe. A straight flue up the well would advertise them like a flag. So he built a concealed channel along the inner well lining, tucking the stovepipe into the stone's shadow. 15 feet up, he set thin rock baffles that broke up. The smoke cooled it and let it drift into the well's air column instead of shooting out in a visible plume. On bright days, they burned nothing. On storm days, they burned only the driest wood. The entrance had to vanish too. No fixed ladder. Thomas made a rope ladder with hardwood rungs and a pulley so it could be hauled up and hidden below. At the chamber floor, Sarah hung a heavy canvas curtain. Across the shaft, an airlock. It cut drafts, trapped heat, and swallowed sound. Light came from tallow candles and a single kerosene lantern, used like medicine only when needed, only in small doses. Sarah learned the dimness the way some people learn a new language. Emma adapted fastest. Children do. The boys, nearly grown, had to be taught quiet, how to move without anger, how to breathe without shouting at the walls. They built bunks along one wall, narrow frames, stacked tight blankets aired and then sealed in oilcloth against damp. Thomas and Sarah slept opposite on a wider plank bed topped with a husk mattress. A feed sack curtain divided sleeping from cooking privacy, as thin as cloth, but dignity needs even thin things. Food went down last root vegetables packed in sand beans, in a barrel flour, in a tin-lined box salt pork wrapped, and hung dried apples and venison in cloth bags from ceiling beams. Every item had a number in Thomas's notebook, weights, dates, and how long it had to last. Water was the one chore they couldn't solve with clever carpentry. A spring lay a quarter-mile away. Every third night after full dark, Thomas or one of the boys walked it, with buckets moving like they belonged to the wind, not the road. Underground water stayed cool and sweet for days. Underground waste had to be handled like another form of fire, contained, controlled, respected. Thomas cut a small side alcove and dug a pit lined with sand and ash. After each use, a handful of stove ash went down. It kept odors down and broke things back toward earth. In a tight room, cleanliness isn't pride, it's survival. The first week below ground was the strangest. Above, they'd lived by the sun. Below, dawn was guessed by routine. Sarah made mornings by lighting the stove, warming water, washing hands and faces in strict turns. Meals arrived at set hours, not because hunger asked, but because order kept panic from spreading. Thomas drilled the boys on tasks the way a foreman does check. The flue path, feel the well lining for cold drafts. Examine timbers for creak. Emma practiced letters on slate by lantern glow, the chalk scratching like a tiny mouse in the quiet. The chamber smelled of earth, wood smoke, and human closeness, an honest smell, but heavy. Thomas carried the heaviest weight because the plan was his. Each evening after dark, he lifted the well cover a finger's width and scanned the horizon. Twice he saw lanterns at the old house, the bank's caretaker, staying warm in Thomas's kitchen, burning Thomas's wood. Thomas's hands shook with a rage he could not afford. Sarah's palm on his sleeve brought him back. Winter doesn't reward anger. It rewards what works. After 3 weeks, The caretaker left. The house stood empty, doors swelling shut, windows frosting from the inside, a shell waiting for buyers who didn't exist. But the banker's pride remained. Pride hunts even when profit does not. A sympathetic grocer in town, the kind of man who'd seen too many families ruined by tidy signatures, fed Thomas scraps of news. Through a simple signal, a folded paper tucked under a flat stone near the spring. Men were asking questions. Had anyone seen the Brennans? Did they head for Oklahoma? Did they die on the road? Rumors multiplied and contradicted each other, which was a gift. A lie with many faces is harder to kill. Still, Thomas marked every risk in his notebook, and he set an open loop for himself, a promise that kept him steady. By mid-January, he would have numbers, real temperatures, and fuel counts that would tell him whether the earth was truly shelter or just a slower coffin. January arrived with the kind of cold that makes wood talk. Above ground, Thomas's hidden thermometer hung inside the well mouth. Under the lip read 10 below, then 15, then 20. Wind turned that into something worse. Below, the chamber held at 46 to 49 degrees with the stove idling. Cold, yes, but stable. Stability is wealth in winter. Thomas kept fuel records, one armload of dry hedge and cottonwood, each evening a small reload before dawn, and a midday handful only on the worst days. Neighboring farms, those still occupied, were burning 3 times that and still waking to ice in their wash basins. The numbers were beginning to speak. Then winter tried to take the microphone back. Mid-January, a blizzard rolled in like a wall, swallowing fence lines and turning the road into a white guess. The wind found every flaw above ground and punished it. Underground, the danger came from the one place Thomas could not fully control airflow. 2 nights into the storm, the stove began to backpuff smoke into the room, thin at first, then insistent. Sarah's eyes watered. Emma coughed. Thomas killed the fire to a coal bed and listened. Ice, he realized, had formed higher up the shaft, narrowing the draft like a thumb over a straw. In winter, ventilation isn't comfort. It's life. Thomas waited for the loudest hour of the storm, when no sane man would be outside, then climbed. Wind slapped him hard enough to steal breath. He worked by feel, chipping ice with a cold chisel, keeping his body low so he wouldn't silhouette against the snow. One slip and he'd be seen, or worse, he'd fall. When the blockage broke free, the well exhaled like a living thing. Back below, the stove drew clean again. Sarah didn't scold him. She simply set Emma's head against her shoulder and whispered the only thing that mattered. "We're still here." Winter had issued a warning, not a sentence. Yet, by February, hunger became the new pressure. Growing boys eat like fire eats. Sarah stretched soup across 2 nights' ground, hard bread into crumbs to thicken stews, counted beans by the handful. No one complained because everyone could do the math. Thomas made one risky trip to the abandoned barn under a moonless sky and returned with 3 things that felt like miracles: a coil of good rope, a sack of seed corn, and a tin of lard. Close call, he admitted he'd heard voices near the road, or maybe the wind imitating men. If you've been with them this far, subscribe. These old survival systems still matter. And comment the coldest temperature you've ever worked in. Hope is a fuel too, but it burns clean only if you ration it. Emma began asking the question that cut deepest: when do we go home? Thomas answered with care, not lies, but not full truth either. He told her they were in a long winter sleep, like bears, and that spring would wake them. James tried to turn it into adventure. Michael made plans for a treehouse he'd build in the new place. Sarah held routine like a lantern, lessons, mending prayers, spoken softly so the earth could keep them. In those months, their dignity was built the same way the chamber was built, beam by beam, decision by decision. Late February brought the shift that only someone watching the sky every night can notice stars arriving a little later darkness loosening its grip. The grocer's note under the spring stone said Voss had stopped asking. The bank was tired of chasing ghosts. That did not make the Brennans safe, but it thinned the danger. Thomas added up his numbers. Outside lows had touched 20 below. Inside the chamber never fell under 44, even during the blizzard 48. On most nights, with less than a third of the wood his nearest neighbor had burned in a drafty house. He wrote the figures twice slowly because he knew what they meant. The earth had kept its promise. March 21st, 1934. 2 nights after the equinox, Thomas lifted the well cover and smelled wet soil for the first time in months. The ground was thawing. Snow along the curb had slumped into gray piles. A wagon waited west where their contacts said it would, hidden behind a windbreak of cedars. They climbed out one by one, blinking like animals, leaving a burrow thinner and harder than they'd been. The chamber below remained timbers, bunks, stove, and ash pit, a quiet proof that desperation can be engineered into shelter. And when neighbors later heard the story, they didn't laugh. They asked for drawings. They asked how thick the ceiling was, how the smoke stayed invisible, how much wood it took. Ideas like that spread the way warmth spreads in winter from one protected pocket to the next, until a whole region learns. Frontier life doesn't reward habit, it rewards what works. Educational note. This story is a dramatized reconstruction inspired by historical hardship and real physical principles: wine stripping, dead air buffering, moisture management, and reduced heated volume. If you apply any underground or stove/venting ideas, today follow local building codes, fire safety rules, and qualified guidance. This is not engineering, legal, or safety advice.